My child. Do not move past these words too quickly. Something hidden beneath the surface of your heart is about to be touched, and the truth may not look anything like the story you have been telling yourself. You came here carrying questions you rarely speak aloud. You have wondered whether the love you felt was genuine, whether the moments you treasured meant the same thing to the other person, and whether the distance, silence, confusion, and sudden changes were signs that everything you believed had been an illusion. Stay here for a moment, because this is not a message meant to fill your ears and disappear. This is a fictional spiritual story of revelation, and within it, a deeper truth about love is beginning to unfold. There was a time when you believed you understood what was happening between you and this person. Their presence felt different. Certain conversations remained in your memory long after they ended. Small gestures carried enormous meaning. A look could stay with you for days. Even when nothing dramatic happened, something about the connection seemed to whisper that there was more beneath the surface. You did not need grand declarations every day. Sometimes the smallest signs were enough to make you believe that what existed between you was real. And perhaps that is exactly why the change hurt so deeply. Because something shifted. It may not have happened in one dramatic moment. There may have been no obvious goodbye, no single conversation you could point toward and say, that is where everything changed. Instead, it happened slowly. A warmth became hesitation. A conversation became shorter. Something once freely expressed became guarded. You started noticing pauses where certainty used to live. You began wondering whether you had imagined the depth of the connection from the beginning. But what you could not see was that another story was unfolding behind the silence. The person you cared about had entered a private battle within themselves. They were carrying feelings they did not fully understand, questions they did not know how to answer, and fears they were not ready to place into your hands. And because they did not explain those things, you were left trying to translate their silence by yourself. That was where the pain began. You interpreted distance as rejection. You interpreted hesitation as absence of love. You interpreted confusion as proof that you had been fooled. Yet there was something you did not know. The truth was more complicated. And before this message reaches its end, you are going to understand why the very thing that appeared to prove their feelings were false may have been connected to something entirely different. Listen carefully. There are moments when people discover that loving someone deeply requires them to confront parts of themselves they have spent years avoiding. Love can illuminate insecurity. It can expose fear. It can reveal old wounds, unfinished stories, and hidden beliefs about whether someone deserves happiness. A person can genuinely care and still become frightened by the responsibility of that care. They can feel something powerful and still respond imperfectly. That does not make every action acceptable. It does not mean you should excuse behavior that wounded you. But it does mean that human emotions are rarely as simple as, "they loved me" or "they never loved me." And this is where the first revelation begins. The love you believed in was not necessarily the illusion. The illusion may have been your belief that real love always arrives already healed, already courageous, already certain, and already prepared to do everything correctly. Something happened inside this person when they realized the connection was becoming more meaningful than they expected. At first, they enjoyed the feeling. They enjoyed thinking about you. They enjoyed the comfort of your presence. They may have imagined conversations with you before those conversations ever happened. They may have remembered things you said that you assumed they had forgotten. There may have been ordinary moments when your name crossed their mind without warning. Then the connection began asking something deeper from them. It asked for honesty. It asked for vulnerability. It asked them to stop hiding behind old defenses. And suddenly, what had felt beautiful also became frightening. Because you were getting closer to a part of them they rarely allowed anyone to see. That is when their behavior started becoming difficult to understand. One moment, they seemed near. The next, distant. One moment, warmth. The next, silence. You may have asked yourself countless times, how can someone who supposedly cares behave this way? That question became heavier every time you received no answer. But there is another layer. Someone else may have noticed the change in them too. Not necessarily an enemy. Not necessarily someone deliberately trying to destroy anything. Sometimes interference comes through ordinary human opinions. A friend gives advice based on their own heartbreak. A relative expresses doubt. Someone says, "Be careful." Another person asks questions that awaken insecurity. A past experience suddenly becomes a warning in the present. And once doubt entered the room, this person began examining everything. Was the connection moving too quickly? Were they ready? Could they trust what they felt? Would history repeat itself? Could they lose themselves? Could they lose you? The strange thing about fear is that it can convince a person to run from the very thing they are afraid of losing. And that is where everything became confusing. Because while you were waiting for reassurance, they were searching for certainty. While you were wondering why they had changed, they were wondering whether they were capable of giving you what the connection required. While you were asking whether their love had ever been real, they were confronting another question entirely. What if this is real, and I ruin it? That question changed their behavior more than you knew. But it was not the biggest secret. There was something else. Something they had not admitted even to themselves. Your connection had begun revealing a truth about their own life that they could no longer comfortably ignore. Perhaps they had spent years settling for relationships that never required emotional depth. Perhaps they had learned to keep one part of their heart permanently protected. Perhaps they had built an identity around being independent, detached, unaffected, or always in control. Then you appeared. And somehow, you disrupted the pattern. Not because you were perfect. Not because you possessed supernatural power over them. But because certain connections become mirrors. You reflected something back to them. You showed them what they wanted. And that frightened them because once a person sees what they truly want, they can no longer pretend that everything they previously accepted is enough. This is where the story turns. For a while, you thought their withdrawal meant they had chosen something else over you. But privately, they were comparing everything else to what they experienced with you. Conversations felt different. Other connections felt different. Even their own routines began feeling different. There were moments when they tried to convince themselves that distance would make everything simpler. It did not. There were moments when they told themselves that time would weaken the feeling. It did not happen the way they expected. Instead, distance created clarity. And clarity created discomfort. Because the further they stepped away, the more certain memories returned. A conversation. A laugh. A moment when you looked at them without judgment. A time you understood something they had struggled to explain. Something small that you probably forgot. They remembered. And slowly, another realization began forming. They had been evaluating the connection through fear instead of truth. But you were changing too. You were no longer standing in exactly the same emotional place where they had left you. You had started questioning everything. You had begun protecting yourself. A part of you still cared, but another part had become tired of uncertainty. And this mattered. Because somewhere within the story, the person you cared about sensed that your energy toward them was changing. Not through magic. Through ordinary human signals. Perhaps you stopped reaching out as often. Perhaps your responses changed. Perhaps you became less available emotionally. Perhaps you simply began investing your attention back into yourself. Whatever the form, something became different. And suddenly, the person who had been asking for space was confronted with the possibility that space could become permanent. That possibility unsettled them. For the first time, they began seeing the situation from your side. They imagined what their silence might have felt like to you. They remembered moments when you had offered sincerity and received uncertainty in return. They began recognizing that while they had been trying to protect themselves from potential pain, they may have been creating pain for someone who had approached them with genuine intentions. That realization did not arrive gently. It arrived like a mirror they could not turn away from. And then something came to light. A truth. Not about whether you were good enough. Not about whether someone else had defeated you. Not about whether destiny had abandoned the connection. The truth was about the difference between feeling love and knowing how to carry love. They had confused those two things. They believed that if their feelings were real, they should automatically know what to do. But they did not. And because they did not know what to do, they began doubting what they felt. Think about that carefully. A person can feel deeply and still lack emotional courage. A person can care and still make decisions from fear. A person can recognize your value and still be unprepared to build something healthy with you. That distinction matters because it changes the question you should be asking. Instead of only asking, "Did they love me?" you must also ask, "Were they prepared to love me in a way that created peace, honesty, consistency, and mutual respect?" Those are not the same question. And heaven, within this story, is not asking you to abandon your dignity just because someone has feelings for you. Love is not supposed to require you to disappear from your own life. You should not have to become smaller so another person can feel safer. You should not have to spend every night decoding silence. You should not have to prove your worth endlessly to someone who refuses to communicate. This is where the message becomes about you. Because while you were watching them, something had been happening inside your own heart. You were learning. Every unanswered question was forcing you to recognize what you actually need. Every confusing moment was teaching you the difference between chemistry and consistency. Every period of distance was reminding you that your life cannot remain suspended while another person decides what they want. And slowly, without noticing it, you began becoming stronger. Not colder. Stronger. There is a difference. Coldness says, "I will never love again." Strength says, "I can love deeply without abandoning myself." Coldness closes the heart. Strength gives the heart boundaries. Coldness tries to punish. Strength chooses peace. And the version of you emerging from this experience is beginning to understand that real love does not need endless suffering to prove its depth. But now comes the part you were not expecting. Because just when you started accepting that perhaps you needed to release the story entirely, something changed on the other side. The person you cared about encountered a moment they could not ignore. It was not necessarily dramatic to anyone watching from the outside. It may have been an ordinary conversation. An unexpected question. A memory triggered at the wrong or perhaps exactly the right moment. Someone may have asked them about you. And for the first time, they could not give the comfortable answer they had prepared. They paused. Because saying your name awakened everything they had been trying to organize quietly. Someone noticed. What happened between you two? Such a simple question. But it opened a door. At first, they may have tried to avoid answering. They may have said things were complicated. They may have pretended they were fine. They may have changed the subject. But the question followed them internally. What had happened between you? The more they thought about it, the less satisfied they became with the explanation they had been giving themselves. They had blamed timing. They had blamed circumstances. They had blamed uncertainty. They had perhaps even blamed the intensity of the connection itself. But suddenly, one possibility became impossible to avoid. Maybe the greatest obstacle had not been you. Maybe it had been their fear. And once that thought entered their mind, it began rearranging everything. They remembered the moments when you had tried to understand. They remembered times when they had withdrawn instead of explaining themselves. They remembered the patience you showed. Then came another memory. A moment when you had been vulnerable with them. Something you said honestly. Something you trusted them with. At the time, they may not have realized how much courage it required from you. Now they understood. And regret began entering the spaces where defensiveness had lived. But do not misunderstand this story. Regret alone is not transformation. Missing someone is not the same as being ready for them. Realizing someone's value is not the same as developing the maturity necessary to honor that value. That is why the next part matters so much. Because the story is not leading toward you running back simply because someone finally misses you. Something deeper has to happen. Truth must become action. Feeling must become honesty. Regret must become accountability. And affection must become consistency. Otherwise, the cycle simply repeats. This is what your heart needed to understand before anything else could happen. You were never meant to measure your worth by another person's readiness. Read that within your spirit. Their confusion was not a measurement of your value. Their fear was not proof that you were unlovable. Their hesitation did not reduce what you brought into the connection. Sometimes two people meet while standing at very different stages of emotional growth. One may recognize the connection immediately. The other may need to lose the comfort of certainty before recognizing what was in front of them. But even then, you are not required to wait forever. This is where divine wisdom enters the story. You can leave the door of your heart unlocked without standing beside it every second. You can care without chasing. You can forgive without forgetting what the experience taught you. You can hope without making hope your prison. And you can love someone while still requiring them to meet you with truth. Something inside you has been learning exactly that. Perhaps you thought this entire season was about getting your soulmate back. But what if it was also about getting yourself back? The version of you who slept peacefully. The version who laughed without checking a phone. The version who dreamed about more than one person. The version who knew that life was still enormous, beautiful, mysterious, and full of possibilities. That person is returning. And strangely, your return to yourself is part of what changes everything. Because the moment you stop trying to force an answer is often the moment you become capable of hearing the answer clearly. You begin noticing what is real instead of what you desperately hope is real. You begin judging actions rather than fantasies. You stop filling silence with explanations. You stop negotiating against your own needs. And suddenly, the question changes again. Not, will they choose me? But, if they choose me, what exactly are they bringing with that choice? That is power. Quiet power. Healthy power. The kind that does not need revenge. The kind that does not need to make anyone jealous. The kind that does not need to prove that you moved on. It simply says, my heart is precious, and whoever enters it must arrive honestly. But while this transformation was happening inside you, the other person was approaching a revelation of their own. They began looking back at the timeline differently. There was one particular moment they could not stop thinking about. One conversation. One misunderstanding. One piece of information. Something they had accepted as truth without ever asking you directly. And this is where the hidden layer begins to surface. Because part of their distance may have been built upon something incomplete. Perhaps they heard an opinion about you. Perhaps they misunderstood something you said. Perhaps they assumed your silence meant indifference when you were actually protecting yourself. Perhaps they believed you had already moved on. Perhaps they interpreted your strength as proof that you did not care. Whatever the misunderstanding was, it shaped their choices. Until something contradicted it. And when that contradiction appeared, their entire interpretation began collapsing. Imagine realizing that a decision you made emotionally had been built on an assumption. Imagine discovering that the person you thought had stopped caring may simply have been waiting for honesty. Imagine realizing that while you were protecting yourself from rejection, the other person was doing exactly the same thing. That is the kind of truth that can keep someone awake. And in this story, it did. They replayed everything. Not once. Again and again. Suddenly, moments that seemed meaningless carried different meanings. Your distance looked different. Your words sounded different. Your patience looked different. Even your silence looked different. Then they remembered something you had said long ago. Something simple. Perhaps you told them that honesty mattered to you. Perhaps you told them you would rather hear a difficult truth than live inside uncertainty. Perhaps you showed them, without realizing it, exactly how you needed to be loved. And now they understood that the answer had been in front of them. They did not need a perfect speech. They needed courage. But courage demanded something uncomfortable. They would have to admit where they had been wrong. They would have to acknowledge that their actions affected you. They would have to risk discovering that you might no longer be waiting. And that last possibility frightened them most. Because somewhere between their withdrawal and their awakening, you had changed. You were beginning to recognize your own worth without needing their confirmation. They could feel it through the way you carried yourself. The old dynamic was disappearing. If they returned, they could not return with the same confusion. Something genuine would be required. And then came the moment that changed the direction of the entire story. Late in the quiet of their thoughts, they made a decision. Not yet the decision you think. Something smaller. But perhaps more important. They decided to stop lying to themselves. They admitted that they cared. They admitted that distance had not erased what they felt. They admitted that fear had influenced choices they once called logic. And finally, they admitted the hardest thing. They did not know whether they had realized all of this too late. That realization opened something inside them. For the first time, instead of asking what you could give them, they began asking what they had actually given you. Was it security? Was it clarity? Was it consistency? Or had they given you beautiful moments surrounded by uncertainty? The answer humbled them. And this is where the spiritual meaning becomes deeper. Sometimes awakening is not receiving what you want. Sometimes awakening is finally seeing what your choices have created. This person was beginning to see. But you must understand something before the next revelation arrives. Their awakening does not create an obligation for you. You remain free. You remain worthy. You remain allowed to choose what brings peace into your life. If this connection is ever rebuilt, it cannot be rebuilt from desperation. It must be rebuilt from truth. And if it cannot become healthy, then the lesson itself may still carry meaning. Either way, you are not losing. You are learning how to stop confusing emotional intensity with destiny. You are learning that genuine love should gradually become clearer, not endlessly more confusing. You are learning that spiritual hope and practical wisdom can exist together. You can believe in beautiful possibilities while still watching someone's actions. You can pray and still maintain boundaries. You can forgive and still require change. You can care and still walk away from inconsistency. That is not failure. That is growth. And something extraordinary happens when you reach that point. You stop being afraid of the truth. Whether the truth says, rebuild, or release, you know you will survive it. That freedom changes your entire presence. And perhaps that is why what happened next could not have happened earlier. Because there was still one final piece of information neither of you fully understood. One piece connecting the original distance, the misunderstanding, and the fear. When it surfaced, it did not merely answer one question. It changed the meaning of several moments at once. The person you cared about learned that something they had believed about you was not accurate. And the realization came from a source they never expected. For a moment, they said nothing. They simply listened. Then they asked a question. The answer made them go quiet. Because suddenly they understood why you had behaved the way you did. They understood what you had been protecting. They understood why you stopped chasing. And most importantly, they realized that while they had been waiting for proof that your feelings were genuine, you had been waiting for exactly the same proof from them. Two hearts. Two fears. Two people watching each other from opposite sides of silence. And neither understood the entire story. Until now. But there is still something you do not know. Because after this truth came to light, they did something they had been afraid to do for a long time. They opened something they had kept hidden. Something connected to you. Something they had returned to privately more times than anyone knew. And when they looked at it again after learning the truth, the meaning changed completely. That was the moment they realized there was one thing they needed to tell you. Not a dramatic promise. Not a perfect confession. A truth. A truth about why they pulled away. A truth about what they actually felt. And a truth about the exact moment they realized they might have misunderstood everything. But before they could decide whether to finally bring that truth to you, another revelation surfaced, one they had not been prepared for at all. And this one was not about their fear. It was about what had really happened during the moment you first believed their love was no longer real. There is something you need to hear before you decide what the silence between you truly meant, because the moment you thought proved everything was over was not the end of the story. It was the moment the hidden story began. You saw distance and believed love had disappeared. You saw hesitation and wondered whether every beautiful moment had been false. But what was happening beneath the surface was far more complicated, and now the truth is moving toward the light. My child, imagine standing before a closed door and believing there is nothing behind it because no sound reaches you. You wait. You listen. Nothing happens. Eventually, you turn away because your heart cannot remain outside that door forever. But what you never saw was the person on the other side, standing just as silently, with their hand almost touching the handle, afraid of what would happen if they opened it. That is where this story has been living. Between two people who felt more than they admitted, feared more than they revealed, and misunderstood more than either realized. The revelation that surfaced forced your soulmate to return mentally to the exact period when everything changed. They remembered the conversations before the distance. They remembered how naturally you once connected. They remembered the moment when something inside them became uncertain. For a long time, they had told themselves a simple explanation because simple explanations are easier to carry. They convinced themselves that perhaps the connection had become too complicated, perhaps timing was wrong, perhaps feelings had changed. But now those explanations were beginning to fall apart. Because one detail did not fit. And once they noticed it, they could not stop noticing it. There had been a moment when they assumed something about you without asking you directly. Perhaps your response seemed colder than expected. Perhaps you became quiet after being hurt. Perhaps they saw you stepping back and interpreted it as rejection. Perhaps another person's comment strengthened an insecurity already living inside them. Whatever form it took, one assumption became the foundation for another, and soon they were responding not to what you actually felt, but to what they feared you felt. That distinction changed everything. Because fear is a strange storyteller. It can take a delayed reply and turn it into abandonment. It can take a boundary and call it rejection. It can take someone's need for space and translate it into indifference. It can even take genuine love and convince a frightened heart that something must be wrong simply because the feeling has become too important. Your soulmate began recognizing how many decisions had been made while listening to fear. And that realization hurt. They remembered times they wanted to speak but stopped themselves. They remembered words they almost sent. They remembered moments when they considered asking you directly what was happening but chose silence instead. They thought silence would protect their dignity. They thought distance would reveal whether you truly cared. But something unexpected happened. You respected the distance. You did not force yourself into a place where you felt unwanted. You did not continue knocking forever. And because you stepped back, they interpreted your respect as confirmation of their fear. Do you see how easily two people can misunderstand? They thought, if I mattered, they would stop me from leaving. Both waited. Both watched. Both hurt. And silence grew between them. But heaven, within this story, is showing you something deeper than romantic suspense. Love cannot survive indefinitely on mind reading. A healthy connection requires words. It requires courage. It requires two people willing to ask uncomfortable questions rather than invent comfortable answers. And this person was finally beginning to understand that. They realized they had expected you to prove something you did not know you were being tested on. That was unfair. The thought struck them harder than they expected. You had been living your life, trying to understand the mixed signals in front of you, while they were quietly measuring your reactions against fears they had never explained. Suddenly, regret became specific. It was no longer merely, I miss them. It became, I should have communicated. And that is a far more important realization. Missing someone can be temporary. Accountability has the potential to transform someone. But the story was still not finished. Because the information that came to light revealed another layer. Someone who had observed the situation knew something your soulmate did not. This person had noticed your emotional change earlier than expected. They had seen how much you cared before you finally withdrew. Perhaps they remembered you defending your soulmate when others misunderstood them. Perhaps they knew you had remained sincere even when circumstances became confusing. Perhaps they simply witnessed enough to recognize that the version of you your soulmate feared was not the version of you that had actually been present. Then, during an ordinary conversation, something was said. Not dramatically. Almost casually. But those few words shattered an assumption your soulmate had carried for far too long. They discovered that your distance had not begun because you stopped caring. Your distance began because you believed they had. For several seconds, your soulmate could not respond. Think about the weight of that realization. They had been waiting for evidence that you still cared while you had been protecting yourself because you thought their feelings were gone. The very action they interpreted as rejection had been your response to feeling rejected. Suddenly, the entire story reversed. They remembered your final attempts to connect. They remembered questions hidden inside ordinary conversations. They remembered moments when you seemed to be waiting for reassurance. At the time, they had been too trapped inside their own uncertainty to recognize what you were asking for. Now they saw it. And once they saw it, they could not unsee it. There had been a moment when you gave them an opening. Perhaps you asked whether everything was okay. Perhaps you softened your voice and gave them space to explain. Perhaps you reached toward them emotionally one final time. And they answered with hesitation. That hesitation became your answer. You stepped back. They thought you had stopped caring. You thought they had already chosen distance. Two completely different stories formed around the same moment. And this was the truth that changed everything. Not that love had necessarily been fake. But that love had been buried beneath assumptions neither person challenged. Yet listen carefully, because this is where many hearts make a dangerous mistake. Discovering a misunderstanding does not automatically repair the damage created by it. Realization is only the beginning. If trust has been weakened, trust must be rebuilt. If communication failed, communication must change. If someone repeatedly disappeared whenever emotions became difficult, recognizing that pattern means little unless they learn a healthier way to respond. Your heart deserves more than a revelation. It deserves evidence of growth. And somewhere inside themselves, your soulmate understood that. For the first time, they were not merely imagining how good it would feel to have you close again. They were asking whether they had become capable of treating the connection differently. That question frightened them. Because it meant they could no longer hide behind destiny. They could no longer say, if we're meant to be, everything will work itself out. No. Love requires participation. A relationship cannot be built by signs alone. Two people can feel an extraordinary connection and still lose each other if they refuse to communicate honestly. And your soulmate was finally standing before that reality. They began looking inward. Why had vulnerability frightened them so much? Why had they assumed rejection before asking for clarity? Why had they allowed outside opinions to carry so much weight? Why did they retreat whenever something became emotionally serious? The answers did not arrive immediately. But one memory kept returning. A memory from before you. Something had happened in their emotional past that taught them a painful lesson. When you care deeply, you can get hurt deeply. They carried that lesson into your connection without realizing it. You were not the person who created that wound. But at times, you were experiencing the consequences of it. This is important, my child. Understanding someone's wounds can create compassion, but compassion does not require you to accept being wounded by them. You can understand why someone built walls without agreeing to live outside those walls forever. You can recognize their fear without making yourself responsible for healing it. You can love someone and still say, "Meet me honestly." That is where your strength is now. And perhaps that strength is precisely what your soulmate was beginning to recognize. They had once believed your patience meant you would always be available. Now they understood your patience had boundaries. They had once believed your love would survive any amount of uncertainty. Now they realize genuine love can survive difficulty, but it should not be expected to survive endless neglect. Something changed inside them. Not panic. Not possession. Awareness. They began wondering whether the opportunity they had treated casually might not remain open forever. And that possibility made one question impossible to ignore. If I had one honest conversation with them, what would I finally say? At first, their mind produced explanations. They would explain why they became distant. They would explain what they misunderstood. They would explain who said what and why they reacted the way they did. But then something deeper interrupted all those explanations. Because explanations were not the first thing you deserved. You deserved accountability. So the imaginary conversation changed. Instead of beginning with, "Here is why I did it," they imagined beginning with something closer to, "I understand now how my actions may have made you feel." That shift was enormous. Because for perhaps the first time, they were looking at the connection through your eyes. They imagined waiting for someone who never clarified their intentions. They imagined caring deeply while receiving mixed signals. They imagined wondering whether beautiful words had ever been genuine. They imagined questioning their own intuition. And suddenly they understood why you changed. You were not playing a game. You were surviving uncertainty. The realization broke something open inside them. But what happened next was even more unexpected. Remember the hidden thing mentioned before? The thing connected to you that they had privately returned to? They opened it again. Maybe it was an old message. Maybe a photograph. Maybe a saved conversation. Maybe something you had written. Maybe a small object connected to a memory. The exact form matters less than what happened when they encountered it again. Because this time they saw something they had overlooked before. A detail. A sentence. A timestamp. A memory surrounding that moment. Something that proved you had reached toward them at a time when they had convinced themselves you were already pulling away. They froze. Their memory had rewritten the sequence. Fear had convinced them you withdrew first. But now, looking at what remained, they realized something painful. They had begun closing the door before you stopped knocking. And suddenly your silence made sense. Not as punishment. Not as manipulation. As self-respect. This was the moment the truth became impossible to avoid. You had not stopped caring overnight. You had become tired of carrying a connection alone. There is a difference. A tremendous difference. And your soulmate finally saw it. For a long time, they had secretly wondered why you did not fight harder. Now they understood that perhaps you had already been fighting in ways they failed to recognize. Your patience had been effort. Your understanding had been effort. Your willingness to give space had been effort. Your attempts to communicate without pressure had been effort. And eventually, you had reached the point where fighting harder would have meant fighting against yourself. So you stopped. Not because your heart became empty. Because your heart needed protection. And in this fictional revelation, heaven whispers something directly toward you now: never be ashamed of the moment you chose your dignity. You can have a tender heart without making it endlessly available to confusion. You can believe someone has goodness inside them while admitting their behavior was not good for you. You can remember beautiful moments without using those moments to excuse painful patterns. Love does not require you to erase reality. True spiritual maturity allows love and truth to stand beside each other. You can say, I cared. And also say, I deserved clarity. You can say, I forgive. And also say, things cannot return to exactly what they were. You can say, I hope they heal. And still choose your own healing. That is the person you are becoming. But there is another reason this matters. Because your soulmate is no longer remembering the old version of you. They are beginning to imagine meeting the person you have become. And they know something would be different. If they ever stood before you again, charm alone would not be enough. Beautiful words would not be enough. A sudden emotional confession would not be enough. You would listen. You would feel. But you would also observe. Has anything actually changed? Can they communicate when afraid? Can they stay consistent when emotions become intense? Can they take responsibility without turning accountability into excuses? Can they respect your boundaries? Can they love you without making you responsible for proving their worth? These questions are sacred. Because your future deserves them. And somewhere, your soulmate has begun asking similar questions about themselves. That is why their next decision became difficult. They wanted to speak. But they did not want to return with the same emotional chaos. They started composing words in their mind and abandoning them. Too dramatic. Too defensive. Too late. Too little. They considered saying nothing. Then another thought came. Silence was what created this. More silence could not repair it. That realization moved them closer to something they had resisted for a long time. Honesty without guarantees. They could tell you the truth, but they could not control your response. They could apologize, but they could not demand forgiveness. They could reveal their feelings, but they could not require you to return them in the same way. They could ask for another chance, but they could not assume they deserved one. This is what genuine vulnerability looks like. Not controlling the outcome. Telling the truth anyway. And that was the threshold they were approaching. Yet just before they crossed it, another person entered the story. Someone your soulmate had spoken with before. Someone whose opinion had influenced them more than they admitted. The conversation was not planned. But one question changed its direction. Your soulmate finally asked this person why they had expressed doubt about you in the beginning. There was a pause. Then came an answer. And the answer was not what your soulmate expected. The person admitted their advice had not really been based on knowing you. It had been based on their own experience. Their own heartbreak. Their own distrust. Their own fear that your soulmate would get hurt. In other words, someone else's unresolved story had been projected onto yours. That realization was enormous. Your soulmate had treated another person's fear like evidence. And now they understood the difference. Advice can sound wise and still come from wounded places. People can love us and still give us advice shaped by their own history. Not everyone who warns us knows what is actually best for us. And suddenly, your soulmate had to confront another uncomfortable truth. They had trusted outside fear more than direct communication with you. They could have asked you. They could have listened to you. They could have allowed your actions to speak for themselves. Instead, they let uncertainty grow. And this was the point where regret turned into decision. They no longer wanted to keep hiding behind what other people had said. They wanted to know the truth from you. But something else happened first. The person who had given the original advice revealed one more detail. Something they had never mentioned. They said there had been a moment when they realized their initial judgment of you might have been wrong. They had observed something you did. Something quiet. Something nobody expected you to do. It showed sincerity. And they had kept that observation to themselves. Your soulmate's expression changed. Why didn't you tell me? The question hung in the air. The answer was uncomfortable. Because by the time this person realized they may have misjudged you, your soulmate had already begun pulling away. They assumed it no longer mattered. But it mattered. It mattered more than they knew. Because your soulmate suddenly understood that the distance between you had been partly reinforced by information that was never complete. Still, this is not a story about blaming a third person. Your soulmate had choices. They could have spoken to you. They could have asked questions. They could have refused to let someone else's fears become their truth. And now they knew it. That accountability was essential. Because without it, nothing meaningful could change. Then came the question they had been avoiding. What if I contact them and they no longer want to hear from me? For a moment, fear returned. The old instinct whispered, "Stay silent." Protect yourself. But something stronger answered. If you remain silent, you may never know. And for the first time, courage began winning. They opened the place where your name still existed. Their fingers hovered. Words formed. Disappeared. Formed again. They wanted to tell you everything at once. Why they pulled away. What they heard. What they misunderstood. What they discovered. What they regretted. What they still felt. But then they stopped. Because another realization surfaced. This conversation could not begin with everything they wanted to say. It had to begin by making room for what you might need to say. That changed the message completely. They erased what they had written. Started again. And somewhere in that quiet moment, something inside your own heart may have been changing too. Perhaps you had reached a strange peace. Not complete indifference. Not complete closure. Something softer. You were no longer begging life for a particular outcome. You were beginning to trust yourself enough to face whatever outcome arrived. And that is a powerful place to stand. Because now, if truth comes, you can hear it without losing yourself inside it. If an apology comes, you can receive it without automatically reopening every door. If love comes, you can ask whether that love has learned how to stay. And if nothing comes, you can continue forward knowing your life is not incomplete. You are not half of a human being waiting for someone else to make you whole. You are already a life. Already a story. Already worthy of peace. Love should add companionship to your wholeness, not become the price of it. But the story has not reached its final revelation. Because just as your soulmate prepared to communicate, they discovered something else connected to the past. Something that explained why one particular moment between you had felt so strange. They had believed you knew something you did not know. And you had believed they understood something they had never understood. A conversation both of you remembered had carried two entirely different meanings. When your soulmate finally learned what you had actually meant that day, everything stopped. The silence. The withdrawal. The misunderstanding. The outside advice. The fear. It all connected. And suddenly they knew the truth they had been searching for. But that truth came with a painful realization. There was something they had done immediately after that misunderstanding, something you witnessed without ever knowing why they did it. You interpreted that action as proof their feelings were not real. For them, however, it had been an attempt to hide just how real those feelings had become. And now, after all this time, they were finally ready to reveal exactly what happened. But there was one problem. Before they could tell you, they needed to answer a question that could determine whether this connection had any future at all. And when they finally asked themselves that question, the answer frightened them more than losing you ever had.